Can I just do a intro?
Are we muted here?
So yeah, but you don't have to mute yet. Are there any other announcements you want to make, introductions, etc.?
I'd like, okay. So Rabbi Hammerman is going to speak about his recent book that I read, Embracing Auschwitz, Forging a Vibrant Life, Affirming Judaism. Rabbi Hammerman is the rabbi at Temple Beth El in Stamford, Connecticut, having served for over 3 decades. He was a past winner of the Simon Rockhauer Award, the highest honor in Jewish journalism. In 2019, he was awarded first prize by the Religion News Organization for excellence in commentary. He's a frequent columnist for the New York Jewish Week and the Times of Israel, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. He has focused on inclusiveness and innovation in synagogue life, challenging congregants to reach ever higher in setting spiritual and ethical objectives. I feel very honored to bring you to my group.
It is my pleasure to be here. So I'm gonna be so respectful as a guest and ask you all to mute yourselves. This is like has never happened before the age of COVID, where rabbis are saying, please mute yourselves. Also, I see that we are recording, which I appreciate, but I just want to make sure that all of you know that, because it's good to know when you're being recorded in this day and age, or in any day and age. Okay, so again, please mute yourselves so that we make sure that we're all good here. Okay, so I want to begin with 2 beginnings here. First of all, the fact that Sheila Romanowitz is here, I think, is really central to all of this, because she's the reason I'm here in more ways than one. She's the reason I wrote this book. She's the reason I became so interested in this topic. And she's also the reason that I'm speaking here tonight. So all of those come together. And I want to show you this. I'm going to be doing a lot of show and tell here to explain why. Sheila's late husband of blessed memory, Hesh, was one of the original founders of March of the Living. And maybe just a show of hands of people who are familiar with the March of the Living, or perhaps went on it. It's possible. Anyway, I went on the March of the Living thanks to Hesh, and he worked very hard to make sure I'd be able to go as a resident rabbi for our New England group back in 2010. So that already was a decade ago, 10 years ago. And while March of the Living is not a perfect program by any means, it is the most inspirational and positive framing of the Holocaust imaginable for a new generation. At the same time, it doesn't cheapen the very negative aspects of the Holocaust. In fact, it's very traumatic in some ways for the kids. But I want to show you what I mean by that and how it really affected what I'm doing right now. So this is the March of the Living. This is Auschwitz, for those who haven't been there. By the way, I think Auschwitz is a place that should be on everyone's, I don't even call it a bucket list, but it's definitely on your must-see list for sacred places. It is a sacred place. It was the place that was hell on earth, a generation ago. But right now, you can see 10 years ago, that's not hell. That's spring break for Jews. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. Please understand anything I say. I don't mean disrespectfully at all. But these are kids. It's actually more like an Olympic village than spring break, because what you see with these teenagers, and these are like over 10,000 Jewish teenagers from all around the world, and they are representing their communities and exchanging pins like athletes do at an Olympic village. So, for instance, here you have a group from Holland, a group from Greece, and we would march with our communities, with our countries. And yet you see that everyone is dressed basically on the same team. They are all meeting one another, and probably more than a few marriages have happened because of the March of the Living, and definitely lots of hookups too, but we won't get into that. So here we are marching through the, of course, infamous Arbeit macht frei gate in the front of Auschwitz, but it couldn't be more celebratory. You can see the smiles. I mean, there's a determination on these kids' faces, but you see their smiles and you see their sense of commitment to their Jewish identity. And we walk, it's a mile and a half from Auschwitz 1, basically, to Birkenau, which is Auschwitz 2, and that was the far larger death camp. And you walk past and walk through the town of Auschwitz. And I just saw this sign and thought it was unbelievably ironic. Over 800 years of history, Auschwitz, the town. And it doesn't ignore the fact that there's a death camp there, but it also tries to transcend it in its own way, perhaps not tastefully. But we walk through the normalcy of that town, and we end up in Birkenau. And you can see just how the group marches both to a special memorial site. We had Natan Sharansky speaking and some Israeli officials, and then they march back along the train tracks. So I just wanted to give you a little sense of that, and gives me a chance to thank Sheila once again for what she and Hesh did to enable and my wife and my son actually also went on that same trip on March of the Living. There's another word of introduction that I need to give. So the title of my book is Embracing Auschwitz. It's not let's see. It's not exactly the first title one would choose for a book that you want to read. I do want to show you though the cover of the book because I think it's really attractive. I like the color scheme, but but the title also includes Forging a Vibrant, Life-Affirming Judaism that Takes the Holocaust Seriously. And every aspect of that title is important here. Embracing Auschwitz does not mean, and I really want to emphasize that, I know we have among us those who've survived, but everyone in a sense is a survivor. And I really want to make sure that there's absolutely no confusion here. There was nothing good about the Holocaust. You know, what happened during that 12-year period, although much longer if you think of the buildup, but from 1933 to 1945, that was the worst nadir of human history. No other historical event is remotely comparable. Anti-Semitism has been around forever, and there are analogies that can be made, lessons that can be learned, but there is nothing like the Holocaust. No future atrocity will ever be measurable compared to the Holocaust. It was not something one would naturally embrace. And yet, when you look at those pictures, the March of the Living, you see something happening. It's now been 70 years, really now we're hitting 80, since the end of the Holocaust. So it's more than a generation, although 70 years is a very important time frame in Jewish history. Generally, 70 years after a catastrophe, something new is born. So I just want to give you just a little hint of that. After the temple was destroyed in 586 BCE, the Babylonian temple, by the Babylonians, I should say, the second temple was built 70 years later. And during that period of exile in Babylonia, the Torah, just again, please a reminder to mute yourselves. The Torah was collected and edited in its final form. So the Torah happened during those 70 years of suffering, and then the new temple was built. After the horrible destructions of the second temple, which included another catastrophe in the 130s of this era, the Bar Kokhba revolt, don't need to get into details, but nearly 1 million Jews died then. About 70 years later, you have the Mishnah coming into being, the beginnings of rabbinic Judaism, and then the Talmud. Jews expelled from Spain. Anyone know the year? Just hold it up. 1492. It's hard to forget that year. A lot of things happened in 1492 having to do with Spain, and they're all connected. It was, again, a major disaster in Jewish history. About a generation later, 70 years later, you have Kabbalah flowering in Sfat, and the Shulchan Aruch and other great works being written. Another horrible tragedy in Jewish history was 1648. Again, I'm not going to give you a quiz, after this, but 1648 was the massacres in Poland, the Khmelnytsky, the Ukrainian Cossacks massacred a huge number of Jews. It was, before the Holocaust, a mini Holocaust in their eyes, because they never knew what the Holocaust was going to be. So they could only imagine nothing getting worse than that. It was so bad that when the Baal Shem Tov started his career as the founder of Hasidism, about 70 years later, actually it was almost exactly 70 years later, his initial followers wrote, and we have literature that says that he was the answer to the suffering of the 1648 massacres, that Hasidism would change Judaism, would revitalize the Jewish people. And of course, it did. So we see that repeated throughout again and again and again. So now as we hit the 70 year and now going on 80, mark since the end of the Holocaust, it was, of course, a major anniversary, happened this past January, the 75th anniversary of, a year ago, January, of Auschwitz's liberation. So what is happening now? And I contend that what's happening now is that a new Judaism is coming into being. Just as you have the Talmud, you have the Torah, you have Kabbalah, you have Hasidic literature, you have all of these major changes. Jews have been the most adaptable people in all human history. Wherever we've gone, whatever we've been through, and we've been through it all, we've found a way to reinvent ourselves, and that is happening now. And it's happening now in a way that the Holocaust is central to it. How could it not be? It's the most important thing that's ever happened to us. So whatever is happening, and I call it in my book, I call it the Torah of Auschwitz, not to be compared in a sense to the importance of the Torah of Sinai, the Torah, but the Torah of Auschwitz is a new sort of commentary on the Torah, on traditional Judaism. Judaism is being transformed as we speak by how it is colored by the experiences of the Holocaust, the lessons of the Holocaust, and the lessons we learned because the Holocaust happened, including how to be strong as Jews, how to also reach out and help others who are suffering, as the Torah says, to love the stranger. I mean, but all of these are now filtered through the Holocaust. So that, I'm going to start to talk a little about that. But I'll just stop here for a second and hope that you understand that initial point that I'm making. Auschwitz is not to be embraced because it was good. Auschwitz is to be embraced because that is who we are. And we can't avoid it. So most of my life, all right, so it's been a pretty long life, I guess. How do you measure a life? My childhood, I grew up basically in the early, 6-day war period, the 67 to 73 period. Those were my formative years of teenagehood. And at that point, the Holocaust just became part of the vernacular. It had happened already 20 years before, but people weren't talking about it. Survivors couldn't talk about it. Elie Wiesel could barely talk about it, but he's the first who used the term Holocaust back then. And so when I was growing up, it was seen as a burden. I have to be frank, as a student, especially coming out of the 60s, I was sort of a Jewish catalog Jew. I wanted to think of Judaism as being positive and being, do it yourself and being sort of cutesy. I don't know if you ever saw the Jewish catalog, but all of that, the new age.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have the Jewish catalog.
You got it? Okay, good. So the thing, do we have like an author of the Jewish catalog here? I just want to be sure. No, the thing you need to know is that the Holocaust was seen as something very negative, as a burden for us. And we, didn't think that the next generation of American Jews would want to be Jewish if they were saddled with those images, with that guilt. I mean, I remember watching the films like Let My People Go, Night and Fog. I don't know if you had that in Hebrew school, and a lot of my teachers were Holocaust survivors, and they taught important lessons, but I wasn't ready to hear them because I just felt, oh my God, we've got to get beyond this or Judaism's going to die. I want to quote from David Hartman, the great philosopher. Hartman Institute is sort of his baby. So he wrote an essay in 1982 called Auschwitz or Sinai. So something that I'm basing my ideas on in a way. He says, I believe it is destructive to make the Holocaust the dominant organizing category of modern Jewish history and of our national renewal and rebirth. It is both politically and morally dangerous for our nation to perceive itself essentially as the suffering remnant of the Holocaust. He concludes, Auschwitz, like all Jewish suffering in the past, must be absorbed and understood within the normative framework of Sinai. We will mourn forever because of the memory of Auschwitz. We will build a healthy new society because of the memory of Sinai. I think he makes really good points, but I differ not so much in what he's saying, because I think for 1982, I think that was the right thing to say. And I think it was the right thing to say even up until very recently. But he could not have possibly known back then that the recognition of Auschwitz, the embracing of Auschwitz, is bringing something positive to the table, or at least something authentic, something that feels very Jewish, and has in its own way utterly transformed Sinai with that absorption. And I go back to those photos. Again, I think we need to make sure we're all muted. I can't mute you, so please mute yourselves. I hear a little feedback. We can't. What was I going to say here? It's the muting syndrome. Yes, there's a lot that's going on in our world right now, and the Holocaust seems to be in the center of all of it. So can someone who's like hosting mute everyone, and I'll unmute myself, or unmute me? Okay, we good? I still hear feedback, sorry. And I know it's not me. All right, anyway, you all seem to be muted, so I'm not sure. Do you hear feedback, or is it just me?
Yes.
Okay. Rosalind, are you, oh, there you go.
Yeah.
All right.
Hillary, can you mute yourself?
This is
There's
definitely, this is a first world problem, or whatever we call it.
It says mute.
Okay, so yeah, now it's fine. Okay. So getting back to my point is that there's a lot that's positive, and it's reframing. So let me give you some examples. First of all, we cannot get away from the Holocaust. Usually something that happened 70, 80 years ago, all right, Civil War notwithstanding, tends to fade away into history. The Holocaust is only getting stronger. It's only getting, just think of the COVID experience. How often, and maybe I'm just sensitive to it, but I see it in the newspaper at least once a week, sometimes more often, where some comparison is made, something, the Holocaust is brought in, often inappropriately, and by all sides of the political spectrum. We just saw Camp Auschwitz an hour ago, a month ago in the Capitol. You saw the T-shirt. You see, the notion of Auschwitz being cheapened in the most hateful manner. My congregation, I don't know if you've had to deal with this. We were Zoom bombed a couple of Friday nights ago at our Kabbalat Shabbat service. We've learned some lessons, and we're not the first ones. I know it's happened a lot, but it's really such a violation. It hurts to have someone coming onto your service, intruding and saying Heil Hitler. And we had, lots of people there. It wasn't a bar mitzvah, in some ways it could have been worse, but the Holocaust is everywhere. So let me give you some more examples. This was an article I saw in a Florida newspaper where Holocaust survivors were inspiring many of the people who were dealing with being locked down for the first time in their lives. And, Holocaust survivors know what it really means to be locked down. It's not like just quarantine for your health, but for your survival. So they were helping, but the Holocaust survivors were turned to and honored for the inspiration they could give. On the other hand, you had in the campaign last year, US governors being compared to Nazis, which was totally out of bounds. I checked one night, just on a whim, it was last spring, and Anne Frank was trending on Twitter. Anne Frank was trending on Twitter. Think about that. 54 million, 1,000 tweets in in a very short period of time. What is that all about? Well, there were some programs going on at the time having to do with Anne Frank, but what it was all about was teenagers experiencing the world and thinking about Anne Frank as they're holed up in their homes. And this was back in May for a month, 2 months, oh my God, maybe even 3. Little did they know what we'd be going through. So, and I saw here's a compendium of some of the comments that you see on Twitter and other social media from teenagers. At least Anne Frank had a boyfriend. Now I get why Anne Frank's diary was so boring. Anne Frank did this for 2 years with no TV or video games. Impressive. Quarantine is just the Anne Frank challenge. Anne Frank spent 761 days in hiding. I don't know how she did it. We don't have it so bad, kiddo. Okay, that seems offensive, and insensitive. But then think about it from a couple of perspectives. One is these teenagers are experiencing something very real in their lives, and they are reaching to Anne Frank for inspiration. It's like, at a whole different level. When I showed a picture of myself, my wife, and my 8-day-old son, Ethan, holding him up at his bris, he was all swaddled. I asked Ethan 3 years later, who's in the picture? And he said, that's mommy, that's daddy, and a challah. Now, it really works much better when you're not muted. But I have to say, what that means is we have taught our son so well that he is instinctively thinking Jewishly. So there's a lot that our teens don't know about the Holocaust, but they know Anne Frank. And that Anne Frank experience is so universal, is so accessible to them, that they think Anne Frank when they're stuck in their homes for 2 months. And they're learning the lessons, and they're reading Anne Frank. So that's a good thing. The other thing we should remember is that maybe they didn't all get to the end of the book. And if they even got to the end of Anne Frank's diary, Anne Frank's diary doesn't end like the Torah, where Moses says, and Moses died. Anne Frank's diary doesn't talk about the concentration camp part. So up until you get to that point, of course, it's not comparable to be dealing with lockdown from COVID and Nazi occupation of Holland, but in some ways it is. In some ways it is. So that, in an essence, is what I'm getting at with my book. What I'm saying is the Holocaust is alive to us in ways that can enhance life and can teach us. And so I'm going to stop here for a second and just see if there are any questions. All right, so Maureen, your photo is on the cover of the Jewish Catholic. I knew there was something going on there. I could read your cues. Any other questions or anything? You unmute if you'd like to just make a comment at this point. Oh. Is anything I'm saying offensive? Because that's important for me to know, but risky for me to ask. All right, so let me continue. Promise you'll keep listening though, because when we think of Anne Frank, let's see, I think I'll show you a few more, because it just keeps on going. All right, the first COVID death in Israel was a Holocaust survivor. Mm. You can see this from the Jerusalem Post. This, of course, was last spring. Aryeh Evan was his name. He was 88. And, I read a lot of newspapers every day. I look at front pages from all over the country, all over the world. And you would be surprised in places that you wouldn't even know that there were a lot of Jews. people are looking to Holocaust survivors for inspiration, but also protecting them in very wonderful ways. We're seeing it on a local level in my community. We're seeing it elsewhere, where in Israel too, where people have made sure to take care of the health of Holocaust survivors, that they are a national precious resource, and there are so few remaining. And then you get into the whole tragedy question of someone who was able to survive all that was survived by this guy and by so many, only to meet an end, due to this disease, which one might say in its own way is as insidious as, and although it hasn't killed as many among, within our country or the Jewish people, but it certainly has killed worldwide. It is a horrible, horrible disease, and it's a plague. And so people are drawing that connection, Holocaust survivors and COVID. This is interesting. You might recognize it from the photos I showed at the beginning. This is Auschwitz. This is the entrance to Auschwitz. And what are we walking through? This is a bizarro twist. Auschwitz Museum, which is an excellent museum and very responsible one, I have to say. I mean, there's a lot of craziness going on with Poland in terms of accepting responsibility. You've probably read about that, but at least within this museum, you don't see that. Anyway, it became the first museum in the world to install a new coronavirus-proof sanitation device that visitors had to walk through in order to, and this was from the press release, disinfect from COVID, from being potential carriers of COVID. Minimize the spread of risk of spreading coronavirus, as well as other viruses and bacteria, which can be brought inside, for example, on clothes. This was the museum's press release. And so you can look, again, I try to look at things, turn it on its head. First reaction is like the reaction to the title of my book. Abhorrent. I can't embrace this. This is like the most distasteful, horrible thing, considering what happened to Jews at Auschwitz and others. But on the other hand, it's taking the most potent symbol of death, at this camp, and showing in an example of how to protect and preserve life. Because this disinfectant is not insidious at all. It's intended to save people who probably should have quarantined before coming, or maybe they did. But think about that. The irony, it's almost like the irony of the March of the Living, of having in the place that was utter hell, the place that is the worst place ever, becoming a place where young Jews are meeting one another and perhaps establishing relationships that are going to last a lifetime. There's something mind-blowing about that. I want to show you something else. I'm skipping around actually, but that's just what I like to do. Because I'm talking about Auschwitz, the place, and I spent more time taking you there than I normally do because of Sheila, because I wanted to get that March of the Living in. But I want to show you this. It says on the side, this is a photo courtesy of the Auschwitz Jewish Center in Auschwitzim. Remember, I showed you the village of Auschwitzim, the town. There was an old medieval synagogue there that had lasted, that really had gone up until the war, had been in existence. This plaque on the Amud, which, near the Bima, is a stone plaque, and I don't, of course, have the right note in front of me right now because I skipped around, but I believe it is the only one of its kind that was found whole, intact, in the synagogue after the war. Mm. And it says, and it is, this is also found in the Galicia Museum in Krakow, an incredible museum. You have to go there. You have to go to Krakow. You have to go to that museum because it talks about the Jewish communities that, flourished in Poland. Anyway, for those who can read the Hebrew, this is a shaviti. This is an inspirational device, a prayer device. And it has what you would find maybe in your own shul, in your own shuls perhaps, the quote, Da lifnei mi ata omed, know before whom you stand. And then it adds on, Lifnei melech malchei amlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, before the King of Kings, the Sovereign of Sovereigns, God. Then you see Shiviti, and then you see God's name, the four-letter tetragrammaton. Shiviti comes from the Psalms. Shiviti Adonai lenegdi tamid. I place God before myself always. And it's a meditative device, as I mentioned, for anyone who's davening or anyone who's praying. In many synagogues, it's over the ark, so that when you turn to face the ark for the Amidah, for the the big prayer, you're reminding yourself to place God before yourself always. So this was found at the Auschwitz synagogue, intact. And in its own way, now as we begin to turn things on their head, Auschwitz itself, in its own way, is becoming that place, not to see where God was. In fact, I spent a whole chapter in other parts of the book talking about how we can possibly believe in God after Auschwitz and what kind of God do we believe in, but that there's a renewal, a chance to renew life at that place. That worst place of all can be a place to rekindle a sense of life and of awe. So anyway, just wanted to show you that. So let's see. I believe the Holocaust is the one thing that can bring all Jews together. What do I mean by that? You might have heard of the Pew survey that was done. First of all, I'll show you this, okay? This is from just a Google chart. The usage of the term Holocaust since 1945. This one ends at around 10 years ago, so it's not completely current. Usage of the term in books, usage of the term in all kinds of literature, obviously in English here, but you can see that the Holocaust happened and the term was not used. It wasn't really used until the 1970s when it took off. And that's important because it became very prevalent, very much a part of our culture. Around the time Israel nearly suffered another Holocaust, that was the Six-Day War, when the dangers before the war, but also the 73 war was nearly catastrophic for Israel. And all the anti-Semitism that occurred in the 70s and really built as people sort of ganged up on Israel at that point. Also, internationally, there was a lot of talk about the Holocaust through the arts. You might remember a television series in the mid-70s, late 70s, called Holocaust. It was a mini series. I think it was on NBC. Huge ratings. Most important thing that happened, all-star cast. It really was Meryl Streep's first claim to fame, at least on television. It was one of her first. So a great series. It wasn't perfect. Elie Wiesel didn't like it, thought it was distasteful in some ways. But in Germany, everyone watched it. And people who had grown up not knowing this happened here, suddenly it became the most important part of their education. And when I was with a group of my congregants 3 years ago in the summer, we went to Berlin and spent a lot of time there, and we saw how the Holocaust has transformed everything. So I'll show you an example of that. And this is also an example, oops, hold on one second. This is also an example of how what I call the Torah of Auschwitz transforms the Torah of Sinai. Okay, here we go. Does anyone know what a Stolperstein is? If you do, if anyone has ever seen it, if you've been to Germany, you've probably seen this if you've been on a Jewish heritage tour. just unmute yourself and tell us.
Yeah, the stones in the sidewalk that commemorate the death of, or the family lived here, or that kind of thing. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you. Yes. So in Berlin, you see thousands of them. You see the tens of thousands of them throughout Germany and even beyond Germany's borders. It was a
Important
brilliant.
to say that these were commemorating Jewish people.
Yes. It is brilliant because you literally trip over them. You cannot avoid them. And, you know, while houses may go up and may come down, buildings are knocked down, remodeled, that's on the street right in front of the building where a Jew once lived. Not only that, but there's a neighborhood in Berlin called the Bavarian Quarter, where there are signs on every street corner talking about what happened at each phase of the Holocaust, especially in the early 30s, when Jews were slowly deprived of their rights and then eventually were deported from that neighborhood. You go to train stations in Berlin, especially, and you'll see the names of death camps outside the train stations because the trains left from those stations to the death camps. You'll see memorials to the Kindertransport, as well as to the deportations of Jews. I mean, it is amazing how Germany has, and they're not perfect by any means, and there are more right-wingers now growing there, but they have remembered the Holocaust. This has transformed the whole notion of what it means to Zachor. This is Shabbat Zachor this week in the Torah, to remember what Amalek did to us. We also remember the Holocaust, but we remember it not just in terms of getting revenge or making sure that there is justice done to our enemies, but also to remember the victims. And that's something new. You don't find that in the Torah. The Torah also tells us you should not place a stumbling block before the blind. If you've heard that verse in Leviticus. Now, normally when we read the Torah, first of all, it is, you know, basically you can take it literally that you should not impede someone who has disabilities, has challenges. You should always help. But the rabbis also took it metaphorically in talking about how we should not lead someone blindly by, for instance, feeding them false conspiracy theories and fake news. Just saying. That's putting a stumbling block before the blind because they might do something crazy like try to take over the Capitol building. No, just saying. But this is the opposite. The Torah of Auschwitz is saying, put a stumbling block before the blind. Those who are blind to human suffering, those who are blind to what happened 80 years ago, let them see it. And that's indeed what is happening in Germany today. So you can see what I'm talking about. I want to get back to one more point, and I think then I'll pause for questions. I mean, I could go on, but you know, I'm a rabbi. I know when to stop. So my final point is this, and I sort of started to say it. The Holocaust can be the thing that saves the Jewish people, that keeps the Jewish people together. What do I mean by that? Well, you might have noticed that Jews don't all get along. You might have noticed that Jews on the left and Jews on the right and American Jews and Israeli Jews do not always get along. I'm hoping, by the way, I'm a little optimistic. Just it's my nature. I feel that some of the stuff that has been really driving us, you know, to have conflict, some of it is now living in Palm Beach, and some of it is just going to start to calm down. I really do feel that because I think we want to get along. But anyway, here is a survey that was done by Pew Research Center. It's actually two surveys in the middle of the prior decade, of this past decade. They asked US Jews and then Israeli Jews, what is essential to their being Jewish? They could pick more than one thing. You'll notice that, start with US Jews, remember the Holocaust, 73%. And the sampling, you know, it's hard to say who is a Jew these days, but it was a pretty mainstream sampling, which would include a lot of intermarried families, a lot of assimilated families, as well as Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox. So 73%. Nothing else. Leading a moral, ethical life comes pretty close. It's good, but no, not near. Observing halakha, Jewish law, 19%. Wasn't the greatest thing for a rabbi to see. Caring about Israel, 43%. Caring about Israel, not just living there, but caring about it. We've got our work to do in Jewish communities, and Israel has some work to do to help us to care. Working for justice and equality, 56%. I think it might be higher now because of all the justice issues that have come up. Eating kosher, basically, 14%. I don't know about your community, but I think that's not too far off. On the other hand, if you were to say, you're having a good bagel sometime, or having a latke on Hanukkah, or having, matzah brai on Pesach, it would go up. I think food is more important, but they may have framed it just in terms of dietary laws. Having a good sense of humor, 42%. Thank God. Defining who is a Jew by having a sense of humor. But the Holocaust is the highest percentage by far, definitely for Israeli Jews. And just in case you didn't realize it, Jews, American Jews and Israeli Jews do not agree on much of anything right now, but this they agree on. Now, we might interpret the Holocaust differently. The lessons may be more nationalistic and plural and particularist for Israelis. You think of, Yad Vashem, its message, but even Yad Vashem also has a universal message. It has the righteous Gentiles, it certainly focuses on them. America may look at the Holocaust for more of its universal messages of, helping those who are in distress, preventing genocide. Whatever it is, remembering the Holocaust is up at the top for both groups. Sense of humor for Israelis, 9%. I mean, any Israelis here? I don't want to, whatever. I will not say any more. But this is, once again, a really important indicator that it is the Holocaust. We may feel that it is negative, that it drags us down. It may still, but it also brings us together. And if we can find positive messages, and there are so many positive messages in the Holocaust, it can not just bring us together, but forge a new Judaism for a new century. I mean, when you think about the great heroes, the Bible has great heroes: Moses, David, Miriam, Deborah. Not bad. But I think Anne Frank measures up to many of them. Mordechai Anilevich in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And not only do we have these great heroes, we have people who escaped, but we also have people who protected them. Think about, in terms of righteous Gentiles, and not just the righteous of the nations, but also Jews who took great risks to save others, to save especially children in orphanages, etc. So we have great heroism. I make the comparison because often it's made between the Exodus and the Holocaust. What Pharaoh did with the Egyptians there's a definite analogy in collective guilt, in slavery and murder. The Exodus story gives us two potential righteous Gentiles, righteous Egyptians. The two are the midwives who saved Israelite boys. But they may not have been Egyptian. They may have been Israelite. There's a debate on that. Meanwhile, go to Yad Vashem, and you have well over 10,000 righteous Gentiles who saved Jews. So the Holocaust is an inspiring tale. It is a source of life for all of us. Anyway, I want to stop right there and give you a chance to share your questions and anything you'd like to talk about. Shirley.
So you said that every 70 years you iterated different annihilations of our people, and now here we have the Holocaust and 70 years later, and I thought this could never happen again. But Charlottesville, you see the Auschwitz thing, and for the first time in my life, and I'm glad my parents never saw it, I said, oh my God, this could happen again. And Holocaust deniers. So I'd like you to speak to that.
Yeah, there are a couple of points to be made here. One is we have to be vigilant. One of the lessons of the Holocaust is absolutely to be vigilant for Jews and for everyone. Thou shalt not hate has become a commandment following Auschwitz. It was always important, but now we see the dangers of racism. I've devoted much of my rabbinate, especially this year, to combating racism. And that, Charlottesville was certainly an example of hate run amok. The other thing is the question often arises, when is it appropriate to use the Holocaust for educational purposes, to make a point? There is this belief, and this is sort of common, that every argument inevitably ends up with Hitler. It's so already, there's a law that it goes ultimately, and that is the end of the discussion. It sort of ends all discussions. And I do believe there are times when the Holocaust should not be exploited, should not be overused. Not everything is Munich. Not every, appeasement is Munich, I should say. If you were to Google, I'm not I know my politics sometimes comes out. I'm not the hugest Netanyahu fan. If you were to Google Netanyahu and Munich, you would see an astounding number of times when he uses that analogy, because especially when talking about Iran, which, is a whole different matter, but he often uses it. And I think it's sometimes inappropriate, because what it's doing is trying to end the discussion rather than continue it. And our goal should always be to continue conversations. However, when it comes to these rock bottom matters, like hate, like stopping hate, like what happened in Charlottesville, like what has happened with anti-Semitism, like what happened in Pittsburgh, like what happened in the Capitol with Camp Auschwitz, we have every right to bring up the Holocaust, because not only is it a good analogy for all kinds of reasons, but it also is an analogy that will help people to understand the serious implications of what they're doing, what can happen. It's not that every, that every act of hate is going to lead to millions of people being murdered. But in Germany in the 1930s and throughout Europe and in other places too, each action was incremental, leading to another action that eventually led to what happened. And no one knew at the time in 1933, 1934, what was going to happen. So we need to understand these lessons of history. And they are vivid. They are absolutely vivid. I don't personally believe the Holocaust can happen here in America, that something so horrible can happen. But these past years of, this past month has proven me wrong in a lot of levels. So I'm gonna be a little more wary of making those kinds of predictions.
Rabbi, I find it, I'm always optimistic, and I'm happy and Pollyannish, and so as you're talking, it was terrific as an aspirational talk. Like at the end, you said we should remember the Holocaust. That's fine, but as a description, it seems to me to be so far removed from the reality of what we're seeing. For example, I think you have much more data on forgetting the Holocaust among young people, among Jews, being involved in the Holocaust, indifference to the Holocaust, abandonment of the Holocaust. And I don't know what the evidence is. And, leaving aside the sort of careless use of the term Holocaust that it's being appropriated by other groups, if anything, the two things that matter in our lives, I guess you would say Israel and the Holocaust. That's what I would say. But we have a whole separate lecture about the decline of Judaism, about attachment to Judaism, and blah 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 blah. And I don't see any evidence, including that first. I've been on the March of Living, and I've been on an incredible trip to Poland, and I did feel that stuff as an adult. But even that picture you showed of those kids, I've gone with college kids, and that night they're not sitting around mourning the Holocaust. They're talking about other kinds of things that they, social activities, etc. So I'm not sure that this message, aspirationally, it's great that you're making, but I'm not sure that it's embedded in the consciousness of young Jews, or I don't see it. I don't see one iota of it, not one iota of it.
Well, I guess we could find some common ground in the middle then. I mean, you're going to find teens being teens, that's going to happen. But I can only say I see it. I do see it, and I see it with seventh graders. We had a Kristallnacht discussion a year ago now because, well, we are doing online classes, but we were out in the same room, and it was an anniversary. It was an important anniversary. And I was talking about Kristallnacht, and they had lots of questions. And they asked questions that I don't think I would have asked at their age about, about how Hitler killed Jews, for one thing. How could Hitler hate Jews? How could the Germans hate Jews so much? But they knew the Anne Frank story, and they know enough. And these are Jewish kids, so maybe they know more than others. But I sense that the literacy level is not as high as it should be. That surveys have shown, but they all know something about a Holocaust. They all know something about it. And they're respectful, at least, of the fact that it was something that they should be respectful of. I think the Camp Auschwitz t-shirt was mentioned so much because it was so out of bounds. I would compare it to, usage of the N-word, let's say, in terms of racism. And there were officers in the Capitol who talked about, people of color, who talked about how horrible it was to, hear that word 10 times on January 6th. Seeing the Confederate flag, which is, I think, equivalent to a swastika. So these symbols have potency, even if the literacy level is not as great as we would like. And they are, and people like Elie Wiesel, unfortunately now they're few and far between because they've passed on, but Elie Wiesel could walk up to a President Reagan, and say, this place is not your place. Bitburg, the SS cemetery. Who has the chutzpah to do that? Someone with the stature of an Elie Wiesel could do that. So I think that there is still that respect, that awe for the Holocaust as an event. And I'm hoping that it can carry forward to a new generation. I will say that the kids need to become the witnesses. They need to take it on themselves. They need to now embody the stories of those who are passing on.
Well, I agree 100% aspirationally. That'd be great if the young, if there was a kind of realization like the N-word and other things among Jews. But it'd be interesting to do a survey. We have a room full of people here and ask, we're not going to ask, but ask about their children and their grandchildren. How many people tonight, or sure, when kids go on Kristallnacht thing in the 7th grade, or they go on March of Living that night, they care. I don't see it among Jews. Among students, I just don't see it generally, that the Holocaust, it should, aspirationally, and it could, and it ought to, when you're making a spectacular point about that. I just don't see any evidence. It seems to me to be fading from memory. There's a whole literature lamenting the fading from memory.
You are now my focus group. So Cindy, do you have your hand up?
I do.
All right, Cindy, and then Elizabeth.
Okay, what I'm going to say is it imprints a mark when it's relatable. And I know in our family, my father-in-law, blessed memory, was a Holocaust survivor. And we as parents and grandparents need to constantly relate the story to our children and to our grandchildren, because verbal, oral history and making it relatable to people has a bigger imprint than anything else, to hear the stories firsthand. And when people hear the stories and they're, and it's relatable to a person, it becomes real. The first time I went to the Simon Wiesenthal Museum many years ago with my children in California, I was really awed by how well they presented the progression of how normal life and living in a cafe became what it did with the Holocaust. And what scares me in this country, and I just heard Barry Weiss speak last week at an Israeli Bond event, and she said it well when she said, We're not the left, we're not the right. The Jews aren't in any category. They all hate us. And whereas they think we're on this side, this week, no matter how liberal you are, now how conservative you are, you're on the wrong side. And I do feel, unfortunately, like Germany, like Spain, that our era as the Jewish golden age in America is definitely diminishing. I see it and I feel it every day.
So let me just say a couple of things. One is what you were describing sounds like a Passover Seder, that they should hear the stories, ask the questions, tell the story. And I think that's where we're heading, to something very similar to the Holocaust being remembered in mythologized in something like a Passover Seder. But but I also think it's really important for people to understand that they all hate us, but they all love us. What I mean is, they may not love us, but we are seen as the living witnesses of that event, of that horrific event, of the Holocaust, in a way that may have some comparison to African Americans and slavery as the descendants of that event. So, we talk about reparations and all of that. I mean, Jews have dealt with that with the Holocaust, but it's more than just that. We have a moral authority that no one else has. We can say, and even though I didn't live through it, I should say, I can still say in a letter to the editor or to a politician, this is the right thing to do. I can say to my congregation, you've got to treat these people better. We went through something like this. Slavery in Egypt, that was a long time ago. Auschwitz wasn't. And because we have that moral authority, people do respect Jews. People do respect the Jewish message. And the Holocaust is a source of a lot of that. So we need to use it.
I'd like to.
Elizabeth, you had your hand up. I'm sorry.
Yeah. As a child, I first had to deal with my mother's side of the family, where they had escaped the pogroms. Well, some hadn't escaped, they'd been killed. On my father's side, there were many people who had just escaped the Holocaust, and many of the family did not. I had very deep feelings about that, and I was born in the same year as you. And I was the one who was sent to the relatives who were crying alone in apartments during their relatives' yortzites to bring soup and to sit and comfort. And the thing that I came up with as a way of comforting is that somehow you got here. And the reason probably is that someone who is not a Jew may have helped you. And I came up with the idea that there were non-Jews who helped Jews and Jews who helped Jews in very heroic ways. And that has been the focus of most of my psychological research for most of my career, altruism, and mainly an emphasis on Holocaust rescue. I and Samuel Oliner in California were the two main researchers on that topic. Now, one of the things that I found, there are some wonderful books out there on philo-Semitism. There are also some wonderful articles on something I would like to study now, which is on Jewish self-hatred. And however you cut it, it's there. What I find very interesting is in my career, I've been in universities all over the place. And the one in which I found the best treatment as a Jew was a Jesuit institution where I worked for 13 years. And when I said I was going to do research, I got funded by NIH, and they gave me the rest of the money and all the time off I wanted. And I helped them establish the Holocaust Museum in the suburbs north of Detroit. Now, what I found is I came to Columbia, I was so delighted. I mean, I loved Detroit, but the University of Detroit, but I was thrilled to come back to New York, which was the home of my birth, I'm a Brooklyn Jew, and thought, oh my God, finally I'll be among Jews and my kids will be among Jews. My kids are all Zionists, semi-observant, and all very much activists. I was always an activist, which is why I've gotten into a lot of trouble over the years. I walked around with that, buttons against anti-Semitism. I was head of the Jewish Students Organization before I retired, etc. And the only Jew in my area who had a mezuzah on the door, all kinds of Jewish cartoons, everybody see the cartoons like, you can call me anytime, 24/6, things like that. But in any event, I'm the Jew at Columbia, the Jewish professor who twice had those anti-Semitic attacks. What I find is the response to them was very interesting. Jewish faculty hid. They didn't acknowledge they were Jews. Goyish faculty came over and were very sympathetic. One of the things that happened is that I had Jewish kids at Columbia College come over, stand in my office and cry. I came here from Iowa. I came here from Michigan. I came here from Arkansas to escape anti-Semitism, to be among Jews, and this is happening to you. Where do I go next? What do I do about this? However, there were actually no responses by Jewish organizations. This was written up all over the world. I was on radio programs and TV programs all over the world, but there was not one Jewish organization who acknowledged this. And what I got was the most beautiful paintings, shaloms, letters from whole schools, Christian schools, where the teachers said, why don't we write letters to this woman? And I got hundreds of letters from ministers, from Christian congregations, from, I don't know, name the organization, not one Jewish organization. American Psychological Association, American Psychiatric Society, New Jersey Psych Association, all of them wrote, not one Jewish organization. So help me explain this. By the way, the first time I was attacked, I just lived through it and I just, dealt with it, started writing about it. The second time was a couple of years ago. I was already older and not well. So I felt like I was about to have I'm now retired. And that's the main thing. Yeah.
Well, I wish I could solve that problem by myself. I think we're often our own worst enemies in terms of helping other Jews who are facing distress, and on college campuses especially.
Yeah, well, whatever.
I know.
I'm not there anymore. I've been saving money for years to give a scholarship fund to Columbia. Guess what? I'm not.
And then, that is probably the most aggressive campus in terms of the conflicts that Jews have to confront, both against them and, and with them.
But they have a great Chabad, I have to say.
They've got a good seminary right down the street too.
Well, I know, I went there.
Manis, you had your hand up.
Yes. I want to approach things a little bit differently.
I can't really hear. If you can get a little closer.
You can't hear. Am I muted in some way?
No, you're not muted. It's just soft.
Yes. He is muted. You are muted, Manny. You're coming in through Liz's microphone.
Oh, okay. Then.
All right. Now, is this better?
Yeah, much better.
Okay. This is my computer. It's weird. Now it says I'm muted. All right.
Give us another year of this and we'll get it right.
Okay. So the first, go back to the March of the Living.
Yeah.
And where did the kids come from? Well, they came from all over the world, right?
Right.
But how did they in particular arrive there? And I reflect on my own background. Right after high school, I was in the Machon Chutz La'aretz in Israel, and I came there via the conservative movement. I also went to yeshiva. I also had this background that led me to go to Israel in this Youth Leadership Institute way back when. Now, the point is that because I had that training, it led me in that direction. I suspect because the kids in Holland, the kids in Australia, wherever they came from, they had some sort of training that led them to be very conscious as Jews, that whatever that training was, the one I was on, mainly it was Zionist groups, mine it was the conservative movement, but okay. So that's one issue I think that needs to be addressed. How do we get?
Can I just address that really quickly, and then you'll give your second point. That's generally true, but in our community, thanks to the Romanowitzes and others, these were primarily public school kids, public high school kids, who had gone to a special program where for several months we prepared them, we prepped them, and but it definitely is much more common for yeshiva kids, day school kids, Jewish high school kids to be going to programs like this, because it's so hard to take 2 weeks of school off, especially for juniors, when they and seniors too, when they have AP tests in the spring. So, but we got special permission from the local high schools for them to go. It was harder, but we definitely wanted it to be, you know, the kids who needed it the most, the public school kids who may not have had as much Jewish background. So your second point.
The Holocaust can serve certain specific functions. And for years, I've been teaching this course at Rutgers. This one's to undergraduates, race, ethnicity, race, and mass violence. And I've used the film, The Last Witness from Treblinka, about Samuel Willenberg, who survived Treblinka, and it's quite. Now, in that session, one of the first sessions of the seminar this year, I had some Arab students who were questioning me on genocide in Israel, which is ridiculous, and I pointed out that is ridiculous, and so forth. But after I played that, The Last Witness of Treblinka, The Life of Willenberg, and his ending in Israel, where his daughter becomes the architect of the Israeli embassy in Berlin, with Jerusalem stone shown in that. And at the end, I saw tears in their eyes, in the students' eyes, and it was a very affecting film on YouTube. If anybody wants to look at it, it's really quite astonishing. And the Arab students too. And ever since then, I've had no difficulty with them, which is interesting. In other words, it's been really very copacetic in the seminar. So the point is that the Holocaust can serve that if we present it in ways that have a constructive outcome, which in this case it was. They wound up in Israel, that they were successful, and the daughter was a major architect getting this great commission. So
it's a great point. I'm sorry to cut you off. The relationship between Jews and Muslims can be enhanced through discussion of the Holocaust, because there isn't as much baggage. There isn't, the Jews and Christians have to deal with a bit of baggage. There's although I don't believe in collective guilt in any respect, but Christianity in some ways set the tone for what became European anti-Semitism. Now you have cases where, for instance, the Mufti in Jerusalem was an ally of Hitler, but for the most part, the places where Jews did better were the places that Muslims were running in North Africa, Albania, I believe.
Yeah.
Rhodes, there's an incredible story of the Muslim leader there who protected a Torah scroll from the synagogue. So there are, and when we've seen Muslim leaders brought to Auschwitz, it's been really very moving.
That's not true in New Jersey.
It's all, well, I don't know, but it is true that it's a great source for dialogue among Jews and Christians too, because of all the theological questions with having to do with death of God and where was God in Auschwitz. So it's a good place for interfaith conversation. Kenneth?
Yeah, I just have a bunch of random thoughts. So first of all, the thing about the Mufti was not anti-Semitic. He didn't want the Jews in Palestine. And the Arabs who live there didn't want the Jews to take over the country. That's fairly simple. There were Orthodox Jews in the Capitol uprising. You know that, right?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. Hitler is a charismatic leader. The people had to resonate. He had to resonate with the people. You can't blame it all on Hitler. The people wanted it. They were envious. They were jealous. It's happening in the United States against Chinese people who are successful. Chinese people are getting picked on and beaten up by people who have not reached that economic condition. So the idea of celebrating the Holocaust, it's really great, but I think eventually it's going to go away. I think that, like we say at our Seder's next year in Jerusalem, maybe we'll say something like that about remember the Holocaust. But we've had other bad things also. These things, these pogroms. We've had the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah, and those have found their way into the history books. They've been absorbed into what later became new manifestations of Judaism. Holocaust is going to take a lot longer for that to happen. I was distressed to see Yvette's comment about Holocaust being taken out of the curriculum in California public schools. I would hope that it's going to be the reverse, because that's really important that it be part of the curriculum. I know ADL has worked so hard to make that happen. Oh, we got a screen share. Is this something we're supposed to be seeing?
I don't know.
Okay, so whoever, you know what? I think it's important to unshare. Whoever is sharing. Is this human?
I didn't think that we could do it.
Wait. So who was that?
I didn't
who
think we
did
had
that?
the capability to do a screen share.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've been doing it. All right. So I think what we should probably do is wrap this up really soon, unless someone knows who did that.
Yeah.
Okay, because it was not me. Which is, only, oh no, actually it was someone in the group. Okay, or at least someone whose name is on the roster of the group. So I'm just making sure.
No, that
May have
was
done that
somebody, it was Bill
inadvertently. I was
Human's
looking for who
screen.
was still on the
Okay,
chat.
all right, good. We've been through this in my congregation, so I've developed a little sensitivity. So,
Film bombing.
maybe let me, I don't want to cut it off. Any other points you want to make?
Yeah.
Al?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
you can take multiple things from something like the Holocaust. Educationally, I think it's very, very important. There was a period about, I think it was a year or two ago, where there were a bunch of Jews in places like Williamsburg and Borough Park who were being attacked. They were being, their hats were being knocked off. They were pushed. They were shoved.
Year ago,
It
especially
was either
January.
a year or two ago. Almost all of those things were done by teenagers. There were surveys at the time that the number of kids, the education on the Holocaust, only 30 or 40% of kids knew anything about the Holocaust. The lesson of the Holocaust, in terms of sort of the inhumanity that man can inflict upon man, is a lesson that must be learned. So educationally, I think a lot of that can educate people like that, kids at that age, so as not to attack Jews or anybody else for that matter, any other minority like the Chinese who are being accosted now.
Right.
The same lesson, it can be extended to those people. So there's the positive kinds of things that you can take from it. But there are some negative kinds of things you can take from the Holocaust too. If we preserve this memory of this horrible catastrophe inflicted upon the Jews, and create this never again mentality to the point where every threat against Jews or Israel becomes an existential threat, then that exonerates our behavior, any behavior. I mean, because after all, we're faced with something that's existential. So we can do anything to save ourselves. We have to look at this and sort of distinguish, make sometimes fine distinctions between what really constitutes a threat and what doesn't. I mean, at least not in an existential sense.
You make a very good point. And it's a point that I think needs to be made again and again. You can go in either of two directions with the Holocaust. And that's one reason why it is so popular, because people are going one or the other.
Mhm.
One is the direction of affirmation, which is where I'm trying to go. And I think where ultimately we are going. And the other is victimhood.
Right.
And, you know, you can go the direction of Mayor Kahana, who
Exactly.
took the lesson of the Holocaust and said never again.
Right.
And never again meant making sure in a racist way that anyone who threatens the Jewish people is avenged and minimized. And you see the remnants of Kahana running for the Knesset right now, and Netanyahu has joined forces with one of them. So it's still potent,
Right.
but it's not the message I think that is most powerful or most lasting. And I don't think it's the Elie Wiesel message. I don't think it's the Primo Levi message. I don't think it's, you know, the message of Janusz Korczak and Wallenberg and Schindler, and it doesn't have to be Jews, and Anne Frank. So I think we can overwhelm the negative message with a much more positive one.
My point is not that you can, but you must. You cannot let that be the message.
It's very toxic.
Mm-hmm.
It's very toxic, and it is a dominant message. I mean, basically, that was the revisionist message in Israeli politics for a long time.
Yes,
modified to a degree,
mm-hmm.
but there, and I think you see it in BB too. So we need to universalize the message a little bit without losing the Jewish quality,
exactly.
Jewish character
Right.
of it.
I agree.
Because it is still uniquely Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
So Joseph, did you have your hand up?
Yes, yes. I was just thinking in terms of the third thing, which is when you look at the sentence that we read in the Torah, and it says, remember what
Achor.
to you when you left Egypt.
Oh, I see. Yeah,
Cut
yeah.
you off at the pass, and he cut off the tail of you, the weak ones who are in the end, who are tired,
Right.
who are weary, right? You should
That's
remember
this
that.
week's Maftir, right? This week's
but
portion.
that may be more than just remembrance. It may be a warning, in the sense that one of the reasons to remember the Holocaust is that it can happen again. And the ones who suffer the most are the ones who straggle behind. And that's the story, the people who left Germany early, the people who left Spain early, before the Inquisition came. And that's maybe something we should think about. Maybe it's really a warning for us, because you look at the times we live now in America, and we have to fear from the left and we have to fear from the right. And
yeah,
we don't know what's going to be. So maybe it's telling us to be alert, and that if we do start seeing something, not to straggle, but to move quickly.
To move quickly. I think that's what a lot of people did after Charlottesville too, where a young girl was killed, a young woman, an innocent person was killed. You know, I think we saw that we can't afford to wait. So Alan, and then the Schindlers. Go ahead, Alan and Cindy.
So one of the points that I've recently been having in mind, as my wife said, my father's family was wiped out. I think about the Holocaust very often, maybe too often, and I feel for the younger generation. They're really, as you said, most of the kids have never even heard about the Holocaust. But one thing that I've had a realization recently is the whole fact that liberal arts in the colleges are downgraded, and the thing that bothers me is that people don't know what World War I was all about. And you talk about man's inhumanity to man. That's why I don't think this will ever happen in this country, because we have never experienced World War I that really degraded man to animals. And it was only in a situation where people have such little regard for human life that a Holocaust could actually happen. So I think we should probably, renew our studies of world history, and everyone should not just be a computer geek and go into the sciences. I could go into the sciences.
Well, yeah, I mean, let's read history, but let's also get history right. And, I think you can take something like the betrayal of World War I and create analogies to things that conspiracy theories are concocting in our country that are equally serious. I mean, if someone subverted democracy by stealing an election, that's, someone's going to get blamed for that. I mean, that's the conspiracy theory, not the truth. And that can be as potent even as the truth.
Right. And we have that in mind whenever we see both sides, whenever we see CNN and we see Fox for the past year. If you don't know history, you don't realize the risks that we're seeing in front of us. That if we don't realize what happened the past 100 years, this happens over and over and over again. I could almost tell you what was going to happen.
But the difference is
right.
But the difference is this time we have space lasers. So just keep that in mind. We have space lasers. The Schindlers, maybe we'll make this the last question, unless I don't want to rush anyone, but go ahead.
Just to be a little bit positive about things, there have been two recent cultural events that I think have significant implications. One of them, we're all familiar about the Georgia senatorial elections, which catapulted a Jew and a Black into office. And at that moment, there was widespread recognition that Rabbi Heschel was somebody who supported the civil rights marched in the civil rights movement, and that was a moment of commonality. But the other very interesting thing is the book Caste by Isabella Wilkinson, and it is really, really a very important book. And in this book, Isabella Wilkinson, who's a reporter for the New York Times and a Black woman, makes the case that caste systems have very much in common, and she describes Blacks as being the product of a caste system ever since they came to this country. But she compares it to two other caste systems: India and the situation of the Jews in Nazi Germany. And that I think that's a very profound analogy. And in this book, she talks about 8 steps, 8 characteristics of a caste system. And obviously, part of it is speaking to Alan's point about the dehumanization factor. She makes an important point that dehumanization is one of the 8 characteristics of a caste system. So I think the acknowledgement of this bond that Blacks and Jews and Indians have, I think it's a very significant thing that deals with our common humanity. But this is a book that is so popular now.
A number of my congregants have read it, and I definitely want to soon. And that shows you the perfect example of how the Holocaust should be used as an analogy and can be. So Joseph and Sarah, you have your hand up. I see. Did you? Oh, is that? Oh, it was just there. It was remaining there. Okay. So I want to end, if that's okay with all of you, with a couple more slides, because I want to end with something a little more uplifting. I tried. Maybe this will do it. We stumbled, stumble stones. We stumbled in Berlin in a closing school ceremony. This is a German school, is a German student. I didn't really understand what was going on, but it was pretty clear, and people explained to us. Our group walked by. This was in 2017. They were taking bricks with people's names on them, people who had lived in their neighborhood. This is the Bavarian quarter of Berlin. And each child, each student took on the identity of one of the Jews who lived in the same buildings where they now live, who lived in their neighborhood, and told the story of that family, of that Jewish family. I just thought that was so powerful, and it's a great example. I mean, this young girl is not going to forget those lessons. So maybe things aren't quite so bad. This is a photo of a place in Terezin. If you've ever been to Prague, just go 40 miles up the road to one of the most infamous camps. It was not a death camp, it was a concentration camp. It was actually a mini community, but it was a horrible place. Most people died who were sent there. Most weren't killed there. They were sent on to Auschwitz, and they used the camp. You might remember Theresienstadt being used as a model camp, as a camp they brought the Red Cross to pretend that Jews were able to do okay there. Anyway, about 20 years ago, as people were, digging it out, whatever, in the basement of one of the buildings, they discovered this synagogue, a hidden synagogue that was decorated, and these are the original decorations, maybe touched up a bit, by a cantor who was a prisoner in Terezin in the obviously during the war. And this cantor knew the prayers very well, but understood that there wouldn't be even the option of people coming together for a minyan, except in secrecy. So some of the Jewish inmates in Terezin had secret services in this secret synagogue, subterranean synagogue. It's under sort of a bakery. You can see my group is there, and you see that they were inspired. This is a death camp, basically. It's a concentration camp. They had no hope. There were SS right outside the door. Prayers are written on the walls, and this is one of them. This is the end of the Amida, the standing silent devotion prayer. V'techazena einenu b'shuvcha l'tzion b'rachamim. That's the prayer of Modim Anachnu Lach follows. You might, if you know the Amida at all, but it means techazena. Chazon is a vision, like Isaiah, Chazon Yeshayahu. The vision of our eyes will be for your return, b'shuvcha l'tzion, to Zion, b'rachamim, in mercy. Our eyes envision your return to Zion in mercy. That's a prayer we say every day. It's 3 times a day. If you do the Amida 3 times a day, that prayer has never meant more to me than when I first saw it on that wall. In fact, I was with a group of rabbis when I first saw it, and we were all brought to tears. In praying it, because whoever wrote this was a cantor who was also a calligrapher. He had no hope, really. How could he have hope of seeing the land of Israel, much less God's return to it, his own? And of course, there was not the state of Israel yet. And yet he wrote these words and he prayed these words that someday someone would see that return. And he was right. Of course, after the war, the state of Israel was born and Jews did return. Did God return? Who knows? But the fact that this person could have such hope, and these people could stand there and pray despite all that was happening to them, is for me a way to show how the Holocaust can be an inspiration to us to move forward, to have perseverance, to have hope, to have vision, techazena enenu, a vision of our eyes as we move forward. So I hope that is at least a quasi-positive way of ending a very serious conversation. And I really appreciate all the points that you shared with me. And let's do it again sometime.
Rabbi Hammerman, I want to thank you on behalf of Romanowitz's. I'm very proud of my group. And thank you so much for coming. And I know that if it wasn't for Zoom, you wouldn't be here.